August 28, 1945. Omori, prisoner of war camp, Tokyo Bay. Lieutenant Mary Phillips stood outside the women's barracks at 14:30 hours, listening to silence where there should have been sound. Steam rose from the communal bath facility 20 yards away, visible through the afternoon heat. Inside, 37 Japanese women were bathing together under orders. Phillips had issued those orders herself 40 minutes earlier. Standard hygiene protocol for processing enemy prisoners. Delousing, medical inspection, documentation. The same procedures she had followed for 3 days with male prisoners at the camp's main facility. The silence bothered her. Phillips was 31 years old, 8 years in nursing, the last 6 weeks processing surrendered Japanese through facilities across Tokyo Bay. She had heard every variation of human misery in bathhouses during those weeks. Crying, coughing, the shuffle of emaciated bodies moving through water. But not silence. Silence meant something was wrong. Phillips had arrived at Omori on August 26th, 2 days after the camp's official occupation by American forces. The camp sat on a man-made island in Tokyo Bay, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. It had held Allied prisoners during the war, primarily American and British servicemen. The Japanese had evacuated those prisoners before surrender, leaving the facility's infrastructure intact. Barracks, kitchen facilities, administration buildings, and this bathhouse, constructed according to Japanese communal bathing traditions. The 37 women inside were classified as civilian internees, not prisoners of war technically, though the distinction meant little for processing purposes. Japanese nationals, ages 17 to 34 according to initial documentation. Factory workers captured near Manila in March 1945, held by American forces in the Philippines, then transported to Japan after surrender for repatriation processing. Phillips had reviewed their files that morning. Standard detention records, adequate food provided, no reported incidents, the kind of paperwork that suggested routine internment, nothing requiring special medical attention beyond the malnutrition every Japanese prisoner showed by August 1945. Phillips expected to find emaciated women inside the bathhouse. She expected to see ribs and hip bones, the physical evidence of Japan's collapsing food distribution. She expected skin conditions, possible disease markers, the standard catalogue of deprivation she had documented in examination after examination. She carried her medical kit and a clipboard with blank examination forms, prepared to spend the afternoon recording measurements, noting symptoms, recommending treatments. She pushed open the bathhouse door. Steam obscured her vision initially, the humid air carrying the smell of lye soap and wet concrete. The facility was simple, a large rectangular room with shower heads along one wall, a communal soaking tub at the far end. Concrete floor with drainage channels. The women had been ordered to shower first, then use the tub. Basic hygiene before medical examination. As the steam cleared, Phillips saw them. 37 women arranged facing the walls, backs exposed to the room's center. They stood motionless, arms crossed over their chests, heads down. No one spoke. No one moved. The water in the communal tub sat still, undisturbed. Phillips took 3 steps forward before she understood what she was seeing. The women weren't just facing away. They were hiding. Their postures were defensive, bodies turned to conceal themselves from observation. Phillips had issued the communal bathing order expecting compliance. Japanese women bathed communally as a cultural practice. This should have been routine, even comfortable under the circumstances, but these women were hiding their backs. Phillips moved closer to the nearest woman, a girl who appeared 19 or 20. The girl's shoulders were marked with long, parallel scars, raised tissue that caught the light differently than surrounding skin. Phillips counted 6 distinct marks across the shoulder blades, each approximately 8 inches long, running diagonally from spine to shoulder joint. Below those, at the small of the back, were circular marks. Burns. The pattern was too regular to be accidental. 4 circular scars, each approximately ½ an inch in diameter, arranged in a rough line above the left hip. Phillips looked at the next woman. Different scars, same patterns, linear marks across the back, circular burns on the arms. The third woman, older, perhaps 30, had scars on her thighs, visible below the hem of the towel she clutched around her waist. Phillips had trained at Massachusetts General Hospital. She had worked in trauma wards. She had seen blast wounds, shrapnel injuries, surgical scars, burn victims. She knew what combat damage looked like. She knew what industrial accidents produced. She knew what disease did to skin and tissue. These scars were none of those things. The marks were too regular, too similar across different women. They appeared deliberately inflicted, systematically applied. The circular burns were uniform in size and depth, suggesting controlled application rather than accident. The linear scars followed similar trajectories across multiple backs, indicating a consistent method. Phillips turned slowly, examining the room. Every visible back showed scarring. Some women had fewer marks, perhaps 15 or 20. Others had more, the scars overlapping at the shoulder blades where repeated strikes had landed on the same tissue. Several women bore older scars beneath newer ones, suggesting multiple incidents separated by weeks. The medical assessment took seconds. These were punishment wounds, beatings, burns, applied intentionally, repeatedly, to women who had been in American custody since March 1945. Phillips felt her professional composure crack slightly, then forced it back into place. Document first, react later. She needed to examine these women properly, count and catalogue the wounds, establish timeline and causation. The United States Army Medical Corps had prepared extensively for processing Japanese prisoners of war. In August 1945, briefing materials distributed to nurse units anticipated treating between 500,000 and 1 million surrendered Japanese requiring medical evaluation. The protocols were adapted from European theatre experience, refined through 3 years of processing German and Italian prisoners. Expected conditions included malnutrition, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and the accumulated diseases of populations under wartime deprivation. Medical officers received training in infectious disease management, mass casualty triage, and procedures for handling traumatized populations. The training manuals included sections on cultural sensitivity, communication through interpreters, and managing prisoners who might be hostile or uncooperative. The manual said nothing about documenting systematic torture inflicted by American forces. Gender assumptions shaped the planning. Female prisoners were expected to represent a small percentage of total captures, primarily nurses attached to military hospitals or civilian support staff caught in combat zones. The Army projected perhaps 5,000 Japanese women requiring processing across all occupied territories. Most would be quickly repatriated once identity and civilian status were confirmed. Medical examinations would be routine, focused on communicable disease screening rather than comprehensive physical assessment. 47 United States Army nurses were assigned to Tokyo Bay area facilities between August 26 and September 5, 1945. Phillips was among the first arrivals. She had volunteered for the assignment, attracted by the historical significance of processing enemy prisoners on Japanese home territory. She expected to spend 6 weeks documenting malnutrition patterns, treating preventable diseases, and writing reports about the collapse of Japanese public health infrastructure. Academic work, essentially. Important but not dramatic. The 37 women now standing silent in the bathhouse had traveled a documented route from Manila to Omori. Official records provided clear chronology for most of their journey. March 12, 1945, American forces captured Manila after intense urban fighting. Japanese civilians remaining in the city were classified as enemy nationals subject to detention. These particular women had been working in a garment factory in the Ermita district, producing uniforms for Japanese military forces. They were arrested collectively, transported to Santo Tomas internment camp, and held there through late May under standard detention protocols. Red Cross inspection reports from April 1945 noted adequate food distribution at Santo Tomas, proper sanitation, No significant health concerns among female internees. The women were transferred from Santo Tomas on May 20th, 1945. Documentation indicated transport by ship to Okinawa, where American forces had established temporary processing facilities for Japanese nationals awaiting repatriation. They arrived in Okinawa on May 23rd, a 3-day voyage. Then the official record developed gaps. The expected transfer to a designated internment facility in Okinawa never occurred according to surviving documentation. Instead, the women appeared on a transport manifest dated June 15, 1945, aboard a Liberty ship departing Okinawa for mainland Japan. No record explained where they had been held during those 23 intervening days, who had custody of them, or why they were transferred to Japan rather than processed for return to Japanese-controlled Philippines. The ship manifest listed their destination as Yokohama. They arrived June 18, 1945. Another gap opened. Standard procedure required incoming prisoners to be logged into receiving facility records within 24 hours of arrival. These women appeared in no Yokohama facility records until July 1, 1945, when a brief notation in a quartermaster supply log mentioned 37 female internees transferred to Omori camp, with an authorization signature but no origin facility listed. They arrived at Omori on August 15, 1945, the day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. An American Army medic conducted initial screening. His notes, dated August 16th, stated plainly that detainees appeared malnourished but ambulatory, with no immediate medical intervention required. The screening had been visual assessment conducted while the women stood in formation wearing the clothes they had travelled in. No physical examination. No request to remove clothing. No documentation of visible injuries, because the injuries were not visible through fabric. Phillips now understood the critical oversight. Initial screening procedures assumed injuries would be obvious, presented for treatment, or reported by the prisoners themselves. The procedures did not account for prisoners actively concealing injuries, or for wounds deliberately inflicted in locations that standard clothing would hide. The timeline troubled Phillips more than the bureaucratic gaps. The scars she was observing showed healing consistent with wounds inflicted 8 to 16 weeks prior. That placed the injury timeframe between mid-May and early July 1945. Exactly the period when official documentation became fragmentary and unclear. The women had entered American custody in March, showing no signs of injury according to Red Cross inspections. They emerged in August, bearing systematic scarring that medical examination would require weeks to fully catalogue. Something had happened during those missing weeks. Something that left physical evidence on every woman Phillips could see in this bathhouse. Something that had been carefully omitted from official records, either through deliberate concealment or catastrophic administrative failure. Phillips needed to establish facts before drawing conclusions. Medical documentation required precision. She needed to examine each woman individually, photograph or sketch the injuries, estimate healing timelines, and obtain statements about causation. She needed to determine whether these wounds resulted from a single incident or multiple occurrences. She needed to understand whether this was isolated abuse or systematic procedure. Most importantly, she needed these women to trust her enough to cooperate with examination. They were hiding because they expected punishment, or because previous experience had taught them that revealing vulnerability invited further harm. Phillips would have to convince 37 traumatized women that an American military officer could be trusted to help them rather than hurt them. She set down her medical kit and clipboard, making her hands visible and empty. She spoke quietly to the nearest woman, though she knew the girl likely understood no English. Phillips spent August 29th requesting permission to conduct comprehensive medical examinations. Major Harrison, the camp commander, expressed concern about creating incident reports that might complicate diplomatic relations with occupied Japan. Phillips argued medical necessity. The scars could indicate disease, infection risk, or conditions requiring immediate treatment. Harrison authorized a 6-day medical survey with restrictions. Phillips could examine willing participants only. No photographs, as command deemed them too inflammatory for potential review by civilian authorities. Sketch documentation would suffice. 2 additional nurses were assigned to assist, Lieutenant Chen and Lieutenant Morrison, both experienced in trauma documentation from field hospital duty in the Philippines. Phillips established examination protocol on August 30th. Private examinations, 1 woman at a time, in a converted storage room adjacent to the barracks. A translator would be present only if the woman requested one. Complete body survey with standardized documentation using forms Phillips designed herself. Each form included a body diagram where scars could be marked, fields for counting distinct wounds, classification by type and estimated age, and space for the woman's own account if she chose to provide one. Participation remained entirely voluntary. Phillips would not order anyone to submit to examination. 8 women consented the first day. The examinations proceeded slowly, each taking between 40 and 90 minutes, depending on the extent of scarring and whether the woman wished to speak. Phillips worked methodically, measuring each scar with a cloth tape, noting location relative to anatomical landmarks, sketching patterns onto the body diagrams. She had developed a classification system during the previous night. Type A designated linear marks consistent with strikes from flexible implements like whips or canes. Type B indicated circular burns, likely from cigarettes. Type C covered irregular scarring from blunt force trauma. Type D marked surgical scars of unknown origin. The first woman, who gave her name as Keiko, was 23 years old. Phillips documented 27 distinct scars across her back, shoulders, and upper arms. All were Type A, long parallel marks ranging from 6 to 11 inches in length. The scars showed consistent healing, suggesting they had been inflicted within a concentrated time period rather than over months. Keiko refused to discuss their origin. She answered questions about current pain levels and functionality, confirming she had full range of motion in her arms and shoulders despite the scarring. When Phillips asked how she received the injuries, Keiko remained silent. The examination was completed in 40 minutes. The second woman, Yuki, age 19, presented more extensive injuries. Phillips counted 41 scars, including 15 Type B circular burns on her forearms and upper back. The burns were uniform in diameter, approximately ½ an inch each, arranged in clusters that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental contact. Yuki spoke only once during the 90-minute examination. When Phillips asked about the burns, Yuki said one word in English that she had apparently learned from guards: punishment. She would not elaborate. Phillips documented the statement and continued her physical assessment in silence. The third woman examined that day was Michiko, aged 28. She had 33 documented scars, primarily Type A with some Type B burns on her lower back. Unlike the previous 2 women, Michiko wanted to talk. Through the translator, she provided the first detailed account of what had happened during the missing weeks in the official record. Michiko explained that on May 22, 1945, she and the other women were transferred from Santo Tomas camp to what guards called a special facility near Yokohama. The facility was a former textile factory that had been converted into a detention center. Approximately 200 women were held there, according to Michiko's estimate, though she never saw all of them together at once. The daily routine included work assignments, primarily cleaning and laundry for an adjacent military facility, and interrogations. The interrogations were conducted by American military intelligence officers seeking information about Japanese military positions, supply routes, and civilian morale in occupied Philippines. Michiko and the other garment workers knew nothing useful. They had worked in a factory making uniforms. They had no contact with military planning, no knowledge of strategic information, no awareness of resistance activities. When interrogators asked questions, the women could only answer truthfully that they did not know. The interrogators did not believe them. Women who refused to answer questions, or who provided what interrogators deemed insufficient answers, were punished. Michiko described the punishment procedure with clinical precision. The woman would be taken to a separate room. Military police would administer beatings with bamboo canes, apply cigarette burns, or force the woman to stand motionless for hours. Michiko herself was punished 4 times over 3 weeks. The first punishment came after she was questioned about Manila's underground resistance movement. She genuinely knew nothing about any resistance. She said so repeatedly. The interrogator concluded she was lying to protect collaborators. She received 15 strikes across her back and shoulders with a bamboo cane. The second punishment occurred 6 days later, when she was asked the same questions and gave the same answers. The third and fourth punishments followed a similar pattern. Different interrogators asked different questions, but Michiko had no information to provide. Each time, the interrogators interpreted her lack of knowledge as deception or defiance. Each time she was punished for failing to provide intelligence she did not possess. Medical care after punishments was limited. Guards provided bandages and antiseptic for cleaning wounds, suggesting someone in the chain of command was aware that injuries were being inflicted and wanted to prevent infection. But no medical officer examined the women, and no treatment beyond basic wound cleaning was offered. The facility closed June 20th, 1945. Michiko and the other women were transferred to Omori without explanation. The journey took several weeks through various temporary holding facilities. By the time they arrived at Omori on August 15th, their wounds had healed to scars, visible evidence of what had been done but no longer requiring immediate medical intervention. Phillips documented Michiko's account verbatim, filling 4 pages of notes. Over the following days, she examined 23 additional women. 19 of them provided similar accounts with consistent details. Same facility near Yokohama. Same interrogation pattern seeking military intelligence. Same punishment system for women who could not or would not provide useful information. The time frame matched exactly, late May through mid-June 1945. All women reported eventual transfer to Omori after the facility closed. Phillips submitted her preliminary medical report to Major Harrison on September 5, 1945. The report documented 31 women examined over 6 days, 847 distinct scars catalogued, and consistent witness accounts describing systematic punishment at a facility near Yokohama operated during May and June. Phillips requested resources for psychological evaluation and a formal investigation into facility operations. Harrison read the report in silence, then classified it restricted access. He informed Phillips that Army intelligence would handle any investigation. She was ordered to continue providing medical care, but to cease what Harrison termed investigative activities. Phillips was not to discuss her findings with press representatives or Red Cross officials without explicit authorization. Phillips argued that medical documentation was not investigation, but rather standard patient care. Establishing how injuries occurred was essential for determining appropriate treatment. Harrison acknowledged her point, but maintained that the circumstances described in the report had potential implications beyond medical care. The matter required careful handling through proper military channels. A compromise was reached. Phillips could continue examinations if women requested them, but she was not to actively question prisoners about circumstances surrounding their injuries. Document what they volunteered, but do not interrogate. Captain Robert Chen from Military Intelligence was assigned to review classified files related to detention facilities operated in the Yokohama area during the period in question. Chen had served as an intelligence analyst in the Philippines before transferring to occupation duty in Japan. He understood interrogation procedures and was familiar with the network of temporary facilities established for processing Japanese prisoners during the final months of the war. Chen discovered that the facility the women described had an official designation: Special Interrogation Center No. 7. It operated from May 15th through June 20th, 1945, with the stated purpose of gathering intelligence from Japanese civilian prisoners who might possess knowledge of military operations, supply networks, or resistance activities in formerly occupied territories. Approximately 300 prisoners were processed through the facility during its 5-week operation. 200 were women, 100 were men. All had been captured in the Philippines and were being held for intelligence assessment before repatriation. The facility was staffed by 6 United States intelligence officers, 14 military police, and 3 Nisei translators. Intelligence reports filed during the facility's operation indicated minimal useful intelligence was obtained despite extensive interrogation efforts. Most prisoners were low-level civilians with no access to military information. The reports noted that subjects were frequently uncooperative and that standard interrogation techniques proved largely ineffective. Chen found documentation of authorized interrogation protocols. Lengthy questioning sessions were permitted, as was sleep deprivation through scheduling of interrogations at irregular hours. Reduced food rations could be used as an incentive for cooperation. Isolation from other prisoners was authorized to prevent coordination of stories. These techniques were considered acceptable under military intelligence guidelines applicable in 1945. Physical punishment was not listed among authorized techniques. Chen found no official protocol approving beatings, burns, or other forms of bodily harm during interrogations. However, he also found no explicit prohibition. The regulations were silent on the question, apparently assuming that physical abuse would not occur or would be addressed through standard military discipline if it did. The facility's paper trail revealed administrative awareness of problems. On May 28, 1945, the International Red Cross requested permission to inspect the facility. The request was denied with the explanation that security considerations prevented civilian access to active intelligence operations. On June 3rd, a medical officer assigned to the facility filed a report expressing concerns about detainee treatment. The report was forwarded to the facility commander with a request for response. No response was documented. On June 8th, 2 military police filed complaints about what they termed excessive force used by interrogators during prisoner handling. The complaints were investigated by the facility commander's aide, who concluded the incidents resulted from personality conflicts between MPs and intelligence officers, rather than actual policy violations. On June 18th, the facility commander received orders to cease operations and transfer all detainees to standard prisoner of war camps. The facility closed June 20th as ordered. The official reason given for closure was operational efficiency, as interrogation operations were being consolidated at fewer locations due to the approaching end of hostilities. Chen identified the 6 intelligence officers who had worked at the facility. 4 were still stationed in Japan. 2 had returned to the United States. Captain Williams had been transferred to Korea in August. Lieutenant Morrison had received discharge and returned to California. Captain Rogers was currently stationed in Tokyo, ironically working on documentation of Japanese war crimes. Lieutenant Yamada, a Nisei translator, was serving at Tokyo headquarters in an administrative capacity. Chen interviewed Rogers on September 10th. Rogers acknowledged that the facility existed and that he had conducted interrogations there during May and June. He maintained that his interrogation methods followed standard procedures. When asked about physical punishment of prisoners, Rogers denied direct knowledge. He stated that military police handled security and prisoner discipline. If MPs used force, it would have been in response to prisoner resistance or escape attempts. Rogers characterized the prisoners as uncooperative and frequently deceptive in their responses. He insisted his own interrogations were conducted by the book according to intelligence manual guidelines. Chen interviewed Yamada on September 12th. Yamada proved more forthcoming, perhaps because his lower rank gave him less personal liability. He acknowledged that things got out of hand at the facility. Command pressure for actionable intelligence created an environment where interrogators became increasingly aggressive when prisoners failed to provide useful information. Yamada admitted seeing women with visible injuries and bruising. He had assumed these resulted from the women resisting military police during transport or cell assignments. He never directly witnessed punishment being administered during interrogations because translators were typically dismissed from the room when interrogators decided to apply pressure beyond verbal questioning. Yamada stated he felt uncomfortable with aspects of the facility's operations, but did not report his concerns through official channels. As the lowest-ranking person present, and as a Nisei, in an environment where his loyalty was sometimes questioned, he felt his complaints would not be taken seriously and might result in his own reassignment or disciplinary action. Chen traced the command structure. The facility reported directly to Colonel Thompson, who served on the G2 intelligence staff under Manila command structure before transferring to Japan in July. Thompson's decisions regarding the facility could be tracked through dated memoranda. He had personally denied the Red Cross inspection request on May 28th. The medical officer's report reached his desk on June 4th, but no documented response existed. The MP complaints were investigated by Thompson's aide, who reported back that the issues were minor personnel disagreements. On September 20th, Phillips received notification that her medical documentation would not result in criminal prosecutions or formal disciplinary proceedings against any personnel involved in operating the Yokohama facility. The legal reasoning was explained by a judge advocate officer who met with her at camp headquarters. No specific military regulation in 1945 explicitly prohibited harsh interrogation techniques against enemy nationals during wartime. The Geneva Convention established protections for prisoners of war, but the women had been classified as civilian internees, a different legal category with less clearly defined protections. The facility had closed before the war officially ended, meaning no ongoing violations existed that required immediate intervention. All interrogators who were questioned maintained they had followed orders and operated within understood guidelines. No direct evidence linked specific officers to specific acts of physical punishment. Finally, the judge advocate noted that prosecuting American officers while simultaneously conducting war crimes tribunals against Japanese officials would create complicated political and diplomatic problems that command preferred to avoid. Phillips asked directly whether command was acknowledging that American forces had tortured Japanese civilians. The judge advocate rejected the characterization. Torture implied systematic brutality designed to inflict severe pain without legitimate purpose. The Yokohama facility had conducted legitimate intelligence operations using interrogation methods that, while aggressive, served military objectives. Some interrogators may have exceeded informal guidelines, resulting in what the judge advocate termed interrogation excesses. Those excesses had been corrected when the facility was closed. The incidents did not rise to the level of war crimes or atrocities under existing military law. Phillips stated that documenting Japanese atrocities against Americans while ignoring American atrocities against Japanese created an obvious moral problem. The judge advocate responded that the comparison was false. Japanese forces had systematically murdered prisoners, conducted medical experiments on captives, and deliberately starved and tortured Allied personnel in violation of clear international law. The Yokohama facility had used questionable interrogation methods that resulted in injuries but not deaths, in a legal environment where such methods were not explicitly prohibited. The distinction mattered legally and morally. On September 22nd, Phillips met with Michiko and 8 other women who requested the opportunity to provide formal statements. The women had learned through the translator network that investigations were occurring. They wanted to ensure their accounts were officially recorded. Their stated purpose was not revenge or punishment of individuals, but simply that someone in authority write down the truth of what had happened. Michiko spoke for the group, providing additional details about daily life at the facility. The women woke at 5 in the morning and cleaned the facility until 8. Breakfast consisted of rice and water. Interrogations ran from 9 until noon. Lunch provided rice and occasionally a small portion of vegetable. Afternoon interrogations lasted from 2 until 5. Dinner was rice. The women were locked in their cells by 9 in the evening. Interrogations followed repetitive patterns. The same questions were asked day after day. Where are weapons stored? Who leads resistance movements in Manila? What is civilian morale in occupied territories? The women, who had worked in a garment factory making uniforms, possessed no military intelligence. They repeatedly explained this to interrogators. The interrogators did not believe them. From the interrogators' perspective, Japanese civilians in Manila must have observed military activities, must have heard conversations, must have some knowledge worth extracting. Punishment was triggered by responses interrogators found inadequate. Saying "I don't know" was considered evasion. Crying was interpreted as manipulation through false displays of weakness. Silence was classified as defiance. The punishment procedure was consistent. A woman would be taken to a separate room. 2 or 3 military police would be present as witnesses. The punishment would be administered, usually beatings with bamboo canes or application of cigarette burns. The woman would then be returned to her cell. Other women could hear screams from the punishment room. They saw women return with fresh injuries. The psychological effect was deliberate. Everyone understood that failure to provide satisfactory answers would result in physical consequences. The cruelty of the system, according to Yuki, was that the women genuinely had no information to provide. They would have told interrogators anything to stop the punishment, but they had nothing to tell. After June 10th, following the medical officer's complaint, bandages and antiseptic were provided for treating injuries after punishment sessions. This change indicated someone in authority knew wounds were being inflicted and wanted to prevent infections that might create medical emergencies. However, the punishment system itself continued operating until the facility closed on June 20th. The women initially remained silent at Omori because they feared reprisal if they complained about treatment in American custody. They also experienced shame about what had been done to them. Additionally, they were uncertain whether anyone would believe their accounts. Japanese prisoners accusing American forces of abuse might be dismissed as propaganda or revenge fabrication. Phillips compiled a comprehensive 37-page report by September 25th. The document included her complete medical findings, 31 witness statements from the women who had consented to provide accounts, a timeline of facility operations based on Chen's archival research, and specific recommendations. Phillips recommended formal investigation with subpoena authority, accountability measures for officers who supervise the facility, immediate changes to interrogation protocols, and allocation of resources for psychological counseling for the affected women. She filed the report simultaneously with the Army Medical Corps, Military Intelligence Command, and the Inspector General's Office. Responses arrived October 3rd. The Medical Corps stated the matter had been referred to appropriate channels for review. Military intelligence indicated an investigation was ongoing and they could not comment on incomplete proceedings. The Inspector General's Office concluded that insufficient evidence existed to warrant formal investigation under their jurisdiction. Phillips requested a meeting to present her findings in person. The request was granted. On October 8th, she appeared before a review board consisting of 5 officers ranging in rank from major to colonel. Phillips presented her documentation and argued her conclusions for 40 minutes. The board asked questions focused primarily on current care standards. Were the women receiving adequate medical treatment now? Had psychological resources been made available? Were conditions at Omori satisfactory? Phillips confirmed that current care met appropriate standards. The board concluded that while past events were regrettable, they represented a complex situation occurring during wartime operations without clear violation of existing regulations. The facility had been closed, operations had been discontinued, and current care was adequate. Further action was not warranted. Phillips made a final statement. If American forces did not hold themselves accountable for abuse of prisoners, the military lost moral authority to hold anyone else accountable for similar conduct. Phillips received an official response on October 15, 1945. Medical care for the 37 women would continue with allocation of psychological counseling resources when available. No formal investigation into facility operations would be initiated. No disciplinary actions would be taken against officers who had worked at the Yokohama facility. New protocols for future interrogation operations were being drafted and would be distributed to intelligence units, though this reform seemed largely symbolic given that the war had ended. Phillips's 37-page report was classified restricted distribution, limiting access to personnel with explicit need to know. The women would receive priority consideration for repatriation to Japan, as most had expressed desire to return home rather than remain in American custody. Unofficial outcomes emerged through informal channels. 2 of the interrogators who had worked at the facility were quietly reassigned to stateside duty within weeks of Chen's investigation. The reassignments were characterized as normal rotation rather than disciplinary action, but the timing suggested command wanted them removed from occupied Japan. Records related to the facility's operations were ordered destroyed as routine disposal of tactical documents that no longer served operational purposes. The International Red Cross was never informed of Phillips' findings or given access to the affected women. The repatriation process began in late October. 12 women departed on October 28th, transported from Omori to Yokohama by truck, then by train to their home prefectures. Phillips ensured each woman received complete medical records documenting the care she had received at Omori, along with a letter explaining the nature and origin of any documented injuries. The letter was deliberately vague, stating only that injuries had occurred during detention in American custody and had been treated appropriately. Phillips hoped the documentation would protect the women if Japanese authorities questioned visible scars. Several women thanked Phillips personally before departing. Michiko gave Phillips a small origami crane she had folded from paper salvaged from medical supply packaging. The gesture carried meaning Phillips understood. The crane represented hope and recovery, traditional symbols in Japanese culture. Phillips kept the crane in her pocket through the remaining weeks of her assignment. The final group of 8 women departed December 3, 1945. Phillips observed their departure from the camp gate. The women boarded the transport truck in silence, carrying small bags containing their few possessions and the medical documentation Phillips had prepared. They did not look back at Omori as the truck drove across the causeway toward the mainland. Phillips later wrote in a letter to a colleague that the women had arrived as victims twice over, first by circumstance of war and second by failure of those charged with their protection. They departed with dignity intact, which was more than their captors deserved credit for. Phillips returned to the United States on January 10, 1946. She was discharged from the Army Nurse Corps in March with commendation for her service. The Omori assignment influenced her decision to pursue specialized training in psychiatric nursing. She enrolled at the University of Michigan in 1946, completed her psychiatric nursing certification in 1950, and spent the next 15 years working as head nurse on a psychiatric ward at the Veterans Hospital in Ann Arbor. She became a nursing instructor at the university in 1965 and taught until retirement in 1978. Colleagues remembered Phillips as an advocate for thorough documentation and patient-centered care. She emphasized to nursing students that medical records served purposes beyond immediate treatment. Documentation created accountability, established facts, and sometimes provided the only evidence that a patient's suffering had been witnessed and acknowledged. In a 1975 interview with an Army Nurse Corps historian, Phillips described her experience at Omori, stating plainly that American forces had failed those women and that she had spent her subsequent career trying not to fail anyone else the same way. Phillips's original 37-page report remained classified restricted until 1952, when classification was downgraded to confidential. It was further downgraded to unclassified in 1975 as part of routine review of World War II medical records. The report was fully declassified in 1995 during systematic review of archival materials related to the occupation period. It currently resides in the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland. Filed within Record Group 112 covering Army Medical Department records. The report remained largely unknown to historians until 1987, when a graduate student researching Army Nurse Corps operations discovered it while reviewing occupation-era medical files. The first detailed scholarly examination appeared in a 2003 book about World War II intelligence operations. Information about the women's post-war lives remains fragmentary. Michiko returned to Tokyo, married in 1948, and worked as a seamstress until her death in 1983. Her daughter was interviewed by a researcher in 2001 and confirmed that her mother never spoke about her detention experience. Keiko returned to Osaka, remained unmarried, worked in her family's shop, and died in 1992 with no known surviving relatives. Yuki emigrated to Brazil in 1956 as part of a Japanese emigration program, married, and raised a family. Her son discovered her scars in the 1970s and asked about them. She told him only that she had been injured in an accident during the war and refused to provide details. 19 of the 37 women have been traced through various post-war records. 18 were never located, their names too common or documentation too incomplete to establish definitive life histories. None of the women spoke publicly about their detention. No interviews exist, no memoirs were written, no public statements were issued. Cultural factors likely contributed to this silence. Post-war Japan focused on reconstruction rather than victimhood narratives. Women who had been held by enemy forces sometimes faced social stigma. Speaking about trauma was not culturally encouraged, and the women may have chosen silence as a path toward moving forward with their lives. Phillips died January 3, 1994, at age 79. Her personal papers were donated to the University of Michigan and include copies of sketches she made during examinations at Omori, personal notes documenting her frustration with command response, and correspondence about the case spanning decades. The Winchester Model 70 that John George used sits in a museum in Virginia. The origami crane Michiko folded sits in an archive box in Michigan. 847 scars were documented across 37 women in August 1945. One nurse insisted on recording what she observed. The official response was restriction, classification and silence. The bathhouse at Omori stood empty on August 28, 1945, until Lieutenant Mary Phillips opened the door and looked at what was hidden. That choice to look, to document, and to advocate achieved no immediate justice. The systems that prioritized institutional protection over individual accountability did not change, but the record exists. 847 scars were counted. 31 women trusted someone enough to tell what happened. One report survived classification and eventual declassification to reach archives where it could be found. The women returned to Japan carrying physical evidence and private memory of what had been done. Phillips spent a career teaching nurses that documentation matters because witnessing matters, because someone must be willing to write down the truth even when systems resist hearing it.